Welcome back to another video from the Garage Bowling Alley. Today I'm going to cover blackouts. If you're not sure what a blackout is, the pin setter has two switches on them that stop the pin setter from breaking things, basically. One of them is a deck jam, and one of them is the turret blackout switch. If you ever have like a pile of pins on top of the turret and the deck comes up, it hits the turret, which is the one that the pins fall into here and spins around, it would break the frame. And if it pivots and it comes off that switch, machine turns off, blacks out. That's when you got to get up and hand crank it back down, clear the pin jam, pin setter will come back on. Let me show you where that switch is located. All right, under your cross conveyor here, look very closely, you have that little switch right there. That is your turret jam blackout switch. If you have anything that binds in the turret pivots up here. When it raises up there, lowers back here, and you see a little bolt on there, is pushing that switch. If you have a bunch of pins on top of the deck and they happen to lift up on the turret, it's going to lower that down, turn off the machine, keeps you from snapping a turret. So you want to make sure that's working. If you ever have a machine that's flickering during cycle, adjust that bolt up a little bit against that switch a little bit more. If you really want to test it, lower it. Lower it down a little bit, and if your machine doesn't turn on at all or the problem gets worse, that's definitely your problem. But sometimes that bolt is just barely pushing on that switch and your machine would flicker like at 180 or something at different times. So just play around with that if you think you have a misadjustment, if your machine's flickering. And then now also you have one that's the deck jam blackout switch. So if you ever have the moving deck is shifting back and tries to shift forward and there's a pin in there, there's a switch that's basically spring loaded, and if anything ever tries to move the deck forward and interferes with the movement of the deck, it's going to pull that spring instead of snapping your moving deck. So you want to make sure both those switches work properly before your pin setter is being used all the time, because if either one of them malfunction and you have either of those situations, you got an expensive repair on your hands. Let me show you the deck jam blackout switch and where it's located. This is your deck jam blackout switch right there. Anytime you have a machine that won't come on, make sure, first thing check, make sure this X-washer pin is all the way at the top of that slot. If it's anywhere down here, you got something binding in your deck. Even if you remove every single pin out of your moving deck, every single one of them, even if they look like they're correct, go ahead and pull them out and check that out. Also, whenever you do have a jam in your deck, it pulls down and this is spring loaded. There's a switch right behind here, and whenever that's pulled down, machine turns off. So check that out. Another thing to look for if you do have a blackout situation and your blackout switch on the back that I showed you is not all the way up and you have all the pins out, check all your spotting fingers, put the machine up and see if you don't have a snapped off bolt for one of your two spotting fingers. The spotting finger is located right here. There's one there and there's one right next to it. And once in a while those spotting finger bolts snap and they'll fall down and they'll bind up with the deck and stop it from moving. So you want to go through, make sure you have all 4 bolts in there and none of them are snapped, because that's a cause that happens quite a bit whenever you have a moving deck. If you do have it back there and it is jammed with that switch up here that I showed you, put the deck down at 270 like this, setting pins, take all your pins out. You should be able to pull on this cable here and the deck should move forward and back real easy. There should be no binding in that at all. So pull that cable right there, make sure the deck moves. If it doesn't, try to find out why. Might have had somebody's thumb insert fall in, they got up in the pin deck. There's no telling, but see right here where you have the stationary deck and the moving deck are right next to each other. So if something gets in there, it's going to keep it from moving and you're going to have a blackout possibly. So just make sure you have free movement in that. Like right here, I can pull on it a little bit, but without the pins in there, it doesn't move very far. Just make sure you got freedom of movement. See if you can find something in there. But yeah, snapped off bolt is very common. Let's see, if you ever have a deck jam, that switch that pulls off that switch that you saw in that slot there, it's got a little pin through the very top that's got a little rounded backing on it, which is up against the switch. So if that's ever pulled down, your machine shuts off. There's several reasons why a machine would black out. Now let's go over a few of them, and maybe you can identify what's malfunctioning on your pin setter as to where the pins are when you find a blackout. Now if you're having a blackout on a regular basis and you're finding a double 8 pin, chances are your spider's not locking after it indexes the pins. Indexing, I mean, is when the pins fall down into the buckets from the turret. The spider opens up, pins fall down, and it's supposed to advance and lock. And then the next pin falls through, and if it doesn't lock, well then that pin's going to fall over into the turret and then fall down in the 8-pin bucket. That's where you're going to get a double 8. Now if you're finding double 7s, that probably means your trip lever is multiple indexing. Indexing is when the pin hits the pedal and trips, and it's supposed to only advance one spot per. And if you have a sloppy short link or something's out of adjustment, then you might have multiple indexes and you're going to find a double 7. So there's two usual scenarios. Either double 8 is the spider not locking, double 7 is if you're getting multiple indexing, because the pin's going to go over before it's ready and then the turret's going to carry the pin over and it's going to fall into the 7-pin bucket. So depends which one you're finding. Now Brunswick machines through the years have always been problematic. They have pins that hang up in the buckets, especially on a humid day or something. They just stick. When they fall in the buckets are, you know, kind of soft rubber urethane. Pins can kind of get wedged in there and it's going to go down and set them and they're not going to come out. That doesn't really happen that often, but it does happen. So, and then also if you have a double 5 pin, if you're finding that you're getting, you know, big pile of pins right in the middle of the moving deck assembly, a double 5 usually means you're having a problem with your pin gate locking. Now if you find where you get 20 pins on top of the deck, that's what you call a double dump. Then you're going to want to look at your short link, and I just did a video on that. Go back and look at that one, and it'll show you how to make sure your long link is adjusted right and functioning properly. And also, you know, I didn't cover the short link in that video, but I did cover the long link. So check back in the video I just did a few days ago about the blocking fingers, and that'll cover the long link. But the long link is supposed to lock the snubber from allowing it to drop 10 pins on top of 10 pins. So if you're finding you got a whole 10 on top of 10, that's a double dump. And if you're having that problem during league and you don't have time to fix it or can't fix it, just take out all but 19 pins in your pin setter, and that'll solve your problem until you get through league. Then you can take a look at it. But as I say, check out the other video. Now let's go over all the different ways that it could black out. If you have a double 7, let's go over that one real quick and I'll show you what you might look for. Normally you have a cover on here. There's 4 Allen bolts. Take those off. Kind of helps protect this linkage from getting bent up if you have a blackout. But this is your short link right here. It attaches up here to this bell crank, which releases this little guy right here. There's a roller underneath that, which allows the turret to release and ride the cam one time until it locks back in place. This is what releases it. Here's your short link right here. It goes from here right back here. It's about 12 inches long, but you want to check for free play in here. Make sure when you move the pedal up here, let me take a little load off of it there. See how tight that is? When you move that pedal, it should be nice and tight up there. I've had this back bell crank that's right here come loose. And you got to tighten the nut up right here. When that back bell crank comes loose, you can sit there and move this pedal and nothing happens up here. So you're going to have a lot of slop in there. Also, the fitting up here in the front and the back of the long link slops out. It's just a pin through steel. You know, you want to lubricate those things. Keep them lubricated because they wear out and they ovalize, and then you get a lot of slop in there, which allows the pedal not to lock this guy back in place, because this thing only locks in place up front. When the pedal's up, positively locks that in place. You get a lot of slop in there. This can allow the cam follower to ride one extra time when it shouldn't. There are some good conversions. There's a bolt you can get that goes in the front here instead of a pin. You can have a slopped out linkage up here, but you put the bolt in there that they've come up with, and it makes it nice and tight. It's like a little stud you bolt on there. Also, there's one for the back that's just a little bolt by itself, and it tightens up, keeps you from having a lot of slop in there. So you can take some worn parts, put the little mods in there, you won't have that slop anymore. But you check your bushings right here in the top and the bottom. But like I say, you want to see when you move this trip lever like that, you should see nice tight movements, positive, with this little bell crank down here. And there shouldn't be, see how there's just a little bit of slop in there? You're going to get a little bit, but you want as less of that as possible. And if this thing does actually get to go one too many times, it's going to multiple index, and I'll show you that here in a minute. It's going to cause the pin to double 7. That's where you're going to see blackouts with the 7 pin. Also, this is your turret clutch right here. Whenever the 5 pin goes through, there's no way to advance the turret once, so they had to come up with the turret clutch here, and it's tied to the trip lever. There's a little cam, there's a gear right here on the back that's geared to this. You see the teeth under here? There's a gear on this time delay gear, and it's got a little lobe on the bottom of it, and when it advances, it goes one rotation, it'll actually push the trip lever without a pin having to drop, and that's what advances it one time. And you want to make sure that your turret clutch only makes one rotation whenever it cycles. Whenever the 5 pin goes through, this lever right here by the interlock probe hits this arm over here that's sticking up right above the plate right here. That little arm right there hits that, which causes the gear to make one rotation, advances the pedal one time. So I want to make sure all that works good too, because if it's not hitting the block and stopping, it'll do 2 of them, and that's when you're going to get a double 7. But normally a double 7 is, you know, multiple indexing. I'll go up top and show you that real quick. All right, now I'm going to show you what I mean by multiple indexing. There we go. See, in that case, you're going to get a double 8 because it fell, but normally that pin goes over in the 7. So it's not always cut and dry, but you see how we got a bunch of pins jammed up in here now? You're going to have a double 8 blackout because you had a multiple index on the turret, which right now I've got it set to where it's going to multiple index a little bit more, so that's why it just went past the 5 pin. And see the big mess it got there. So there's the adjustment on that. If your linkage is pretty tight, adjust this stop on the back side. Bring it back a little bit, and that'll make the pedal come up further and lock it in place a lot better. So loosen the little jam nuts back here. You might have to put a pair of pliers or something. Loosen the jam nut. Move that back a little. That should take care of your multiple indexing. Okay, now we've covered the double 7. Now if you're getting a double 8, chances are that's what I said, your spider's not locking after it drops the 10 pins in the buckets. And let's go over what could be causing that if you're having double 8 pins. Okay, the first thing you're going to look for if you're getting a double 8, see that tongue down there in the bottom of the 5 pin chute? What happens if the 5 pin goes through, because we just had this with Anthony up in Missouri at his bowling alley. He kept having his spider not locking. He sat on it and chased it for a long time, and finally Rip Owens said, hey, check and make sure that when the 5 pin goes through, that tongue isn't being held down, because that tongue is also linked to your interlock probe, which is hard to see, but it's under the trip lever right now. It's the one that hits that blocking finger. But if that tongue is pressed, it's going to keep the spider from locking. So when this 5 pin goes through, it's going to push the tongue. It's spring loaded right now. Spider's going to open. And what Rip noticed is that 5 pin, if your turret's not level, that pin can hold that pin release lever open. See right now where it's kind of holding it down, it's almost touching the 5 pin right there, but you might check to make sure your turret's level. If your turret's like low in the front, it's going to make that tongue hang down lower, and that 5 pin, top of that pin can hold that tongue down. So you can also take the tongue out, maybe grind a little bit off of it, you know, maybe shorten it up a little bit. I know they make different versions of it. You know, they don't need to be as long as that is, so you might look for a shorter version. But if you're having the 5 pin hang up on that pin release lever, your spider is open and will not lock. So that's one thing, that's a really big one to look for.
Oh, there it goes. It just did it. Okay, so if you can hear this, the very last shut off of the night. Look at that. It did it. Now, let's see if I can figure out how to zoom in here. As you can see, that lever is sitting on top of the pin in the 5-chute. Now, I'm going to try something. So I'm going to lift this turret and see what happens. Let's watch the spoons. Boom. Yep. It's that trip lever in there. Haha.
Another one to check for. Make sure none of your turret wires are hanging up on your spoons right there. You want to make sure there's a good little, there's not much. You want to make sure there's a clearance in there though, that none of your wires, you'll see a rub mark on there normally if it is, but you want to make sure that there is a little gap in there between the spoons. You might have to bend them down a little bit. You want to be careful you don't break off one of your bolts, but you want to make sure you got a gap here and you're not having anything keeping that spider when that turret advances from locking back in place. But you see how that gap is pretty damn small, but as long as you got a gap there, you're good. But you'll see, as I say, you'll see a rub mark on here if it is, but fix that. Another one to check for is all your spoon bolts right here. See how they stick through on the bottom? Make sure that somebody didn't go in and replace one time and put one that's too long on here. You want to make sure that they're not sticking down too far. See how they don't have a lot of room between the turret frame and the bolt? But if you got one that's too long, or maybe something's coming off, that might interfere with the spider opening and closing. But I'll show you real quick, if you can see it here without the flashlight. See how this interlock probe opens up? There's a roller right in there. There you go, you can see it right there. That's what locks the turret in place. 5-pin goes through on that tongue, opens up that, which then releases the spider and is locked. But when it comes back around, that roller drops in place, spider's locked. But check all your gaps. Make sure you don't have any turret wires rubbing. Check your bolts underneath. Make sure you got 2 for each spoon, that one of them hadn't fallen out. Go back and check your turret level. Make sure it's not low in the front. That'll make the turret hang down a little bit too far, and maybe that 5-pin pin release lever might be hanging up on the very top of that 5-pin. But that's what to look for if you're getting double 8s. And finally, as I say, if you're having 20 pins on top, you have the double dump, your long link is not latching and your blocking finger is not coming down, so the interlock probe is not hitting the blocking finger and stopping it from doing a double dump, as we call it. So say, check my video on blocking fingers a couple of days ago, and that'll cover that one as well. But hopefully you found something helpful in this video. Gives you something to look at, and hopefully you'll be able to find the problem of why you're getting a blackout, fix it. Hopefully you won't have any problems again out of it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. See you again from the garage.